One of the most underwhelming guns in the Democratic Detonation War Bond is, or at least was, the BR-14 Adjudicator. Initially tagged as a marksman rifle, this thing seemed to be a definite worst in class in an already fairly underpowered weapon category. But with some of the latest buffs and a reclassification of this gun to an assault rifle, has the story finally changed for this weapon? Dr. Pooplove here, and let's discuss. So for my initial testing of this weapon, I will be facing off against the bugs, but don't worry because I will be making a bot video as well. Now let's take a look at the stats on this thing. It has a damage of 80, which is not high as a marksman rifle, but it actually is the highest amongst the assault rifle class. Coupled with a fire rate of 550, it does have the ability to also fire very fast. Both of these traits do seem to line up more with an assault rifle. It has a capacity of 25, which is less than the other assault rifles, but this is assisted with the recent buff that gave this gun more total mags at 8, and it has the most recoil at 40. And this was actually a buff because the recoil used to be much worse, but I will have to say this thing still kicks pretty bad, especially at full auto, but we will have some tips later for that. On that note, this weapon does have some modifications. You can switch it from single fire to full auto. I would recommend full auto, especially with the damage under 100. You want to get multiple bullets out fast, and it seems the devs agree because in the patch they made full auto the default where single fire used to be. You also have a couple different scope options, which can be useful if you need to snipe, and in that case I would lightly hold on the trigger to just let 1 or 2 bullets out at a time. It also has medium armor penetration, which is an advantage among most of the assault rifles. The only other assault rifle that has that is the AR-23P Liberator Penetrator. And I do have to say, at least on paper, the Penetrator is probably having a little bit of an existential crisis right now because it's almost half the damage with a somewhat similar fire rate and a somewhat similar capacity. The Adjudicator, at least on paper, looks to be much stronger. But I know there's some penetrator stands who will probably tell me otherwise. Regardless, when you think about this gun as an assault rifle, it does seem to make more sense. Marksman rifles, you think of precision, slow fire rate, very impactful shots, and none of these things are what the Adjudicator really has to offer. It's funny because even before you consider the buffs that were made, this simple reclassification from marksman to assault rifle seems to have changed the narrative on this gun. Because on paper, it did seem like a pretty weak marksman rifle, but versus the assault rifles, it actually looks pretty strong. But how does the Adjudicator actually fare when you take it out on the battlefield against the bugs? And how can you use it effectively? Well, versus the little guys, this will take between 1 and 2 shots. Really, it seems to depend on whether you land a headshot or not. But this actually does make good sense for an assault rifle. I believe the bug's health is 100 and this dishes out 80 with some sort of headshot multiplier involved. There also seems to be some collateral going on here as well. Although it can be hard to tell because of course your fire rate is so high it often could just be another bullet, but I can confirm that it does happen. And I think this is generally a thing that happens with all medium armor penetration weapons. Now, versus the hunters, this thing does shred them pretty nicely. It seems like an average of 2 shots, and you can one-shot headshot them. Although, even if you don't, the bullets come out really quickly and can tear their limbs off, making them go down really quickly. And there is some decent handling on this thing, which is good too, as it can really help you track these slippery fellows better. I will say, this is one of the bugs that this thing seems to excel at. Just having that good ergonomics and fast firing, it seems to do a pretty good job against these guys. Although I have been using the Jar and the Eruptor a little bit too much lately, so those guns' rough handling might be giving me a distorted view. Now, warriors take about 3 shots if you hit them in the head, but they do crawl for a little bit afterwards before finally dying. So for this reason, I would overkill them a little bit. Pump a few more bullets in them, especially if they are close, so they don't end up getting you. Hive guards are also pretty easy to take out with this. Because of the medium armor penetration, you don't really have to worry about where you hit them so much. And Brood Commanders, well, they can actually be a bit annoying, as this gun has no real stagger to it. So you will have to pump a lot of bullets into them to make sure they're dead. It can be almost a full clip if they are charging you to fully take them out, but you can actually kill them in less shots, more like a third of a clip about. But of course, like the warriors, they crawl a bit after their death, so be aware of that and just dodge them if you're trying to save some bullets. Now, for the bile spewers, you can take these guys out in a little bit less than one clip. However, you will mostly need to be going for headshots, as this gun doesn't do that extra explosive damage to the bulging sacks. And also, you won't want to miss much. Pulse firing will help you be able to stay on target with this guy. I've also gotten some even quicker kills with less bullets on nursing spewers by getting headshots, but it's a little bit less consistent. I think it's that thing where you get some headshots from the side. It can help take them out a little quicker, but I would realistically plan on about a clip's worth for any of these spewers. With stalkers, it actually will shred them pretty nicely, but it also kind of depends where you hit, because they can seem to take a lot of bullets. But if you're doing that full auto and you kind of shred their limbs, it works in a similar pattern to the hunters, and so this can be pretty effective against them. Now, one thing with this gun is you would kind of think shriekers would be easy to take out with this thing, but I gotta say, recoil and the need to land multiple shots on these guys makes it pretty hard to get them before they get you. With these guys, you're gonna need to make sure your aim is on point. Now, spore towers, and sadly, I probably won't be talking about spore towers much anymore, because basically this is not gonna happen. Spore towers have been buffed and they now need heavy armor penetration to take out. It's not the end of the world, but it does make me a little sad, especially because I liked using spore towers as a bit of a baseline for some of these guns. Sticking on the utility note, this thing is pretty crappy for the eggs. It requires multiple shots to take even one out. That's okay though. I mean, this isn't the Adjudicator's function, so just take a grenade pistol or something with you for those. Now, things do take a pretty bad turn when it comes to the more elite enemies like the Chargers. This will take way too many shots, as you're pretty much only limited to their butt. And even when you do strip the front leg armor off with a heavy weapon, the bullets do not impress much. Bile Titans, this also doesn't do a ton of work to the sacks, although you can definitely take them out. And that's okay. Not every gun needs to impress with the more elite enemies. That's what your stratagems are for, really. Now, before I get to my final conclusions for this gun, here are some tips to make this thing better in your hands. One thing to mention is the recoil on this thing. It feels very high. On paper, it doesn't look that high, but considering the amount of bullets flying, it definitely racks up. And so you need to get control over this thing. And really, holding down the fire button is not recommended, as your reticle will just shoot upwards. Instead, your best bet is to pulse your shot in a few short bursts in order to maintain control. I tend to try to shoot 3 to 4 bullets out at a time. The further away enemies are though, the less bullets you should fire at once, and the closer they are, the more you can hold down that fire button. One way that you can get more bullets out faster is to just kind of pump your trigger a few times, pulsing in quick succession, which can help you fire very fast while still maintaining that control. You can also counter the recoil in a few other ways. For one, you can start by aiming a little bit low on targets rather than head on, which can help as you inevitably travel upwards, allowing more bullets to hit your target. But also you can try to press down your aim a little bit as you are firing to help control that pattern and keep it from moving too far up. If you ran the burst rifle in factions, you know what I'm talking about. Also, of course, you have special armor sets which will help reduce your recoil by 30% when crouched or prone. The engineer and the fortified armor sets are great at lessening that recoil, and you will notice that crouching and firing gives you great control over this thing. I even hip fire this thing a lot while crouched, and that can be a game changer. The major downside, of course, though, is that you have to stay pretty still and crouched for this to work, and that can be pretty situational, especially versus versus the bugs, where you largely need to be mobile as they will swarm you if you're not running. One thing you can do is kind of just run to get a little distance, crouch fire a bit, and continue running. That's why I like the CE7 Demolition Specialist, because it has that speed and stamina to help me get some distance, then I can crouch and shoot. And because you have much more control over this thing, you can be pretty accurate for a while, which can help take on the incoming swarm before you ultimately need to kind of run away again. All in all, I will say versus the bugs that the Adjudicator is decent. It's serving as something that can take on the smaller enemies very effectively while also being serviceable versus the medium-sized enemies. It feels nice to use, which is reason enough to give this thing a go. And it also seems to stand out a little bit amongst the assault rifle class, especially being probably the best medium armor penetration option for you. It's not going to be the most effective versus the Horde, and it's definitely not going to be the most effective versus the elite heavy armored enemies. It's mostly going to sit somewhere in the middle, helping you with the hunters all the way up to the bile spewers. And so I would just make sure to have some stratagems on you to help you with the Horde, as well as some to help you with those heavy enemies. And as long as you implement some of the strategies to help you control that recoil, you can be effective with this thing. I believe the Adjudicator has a solid footing in the assault rifle class. I wouldn't say this stands out as a top tier primary overall when considering the entire list of guns out there, at least not versus the bugs. But if you like the way this gun functions, if you like the way this gun feels, this can be used effectively and it can be mastered. I'm pretty eager to find out how this thing does versus the bots, so stay tuned for that. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. And thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.